Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We'll just give it another minute or so just to let a few people more to join, and then we'll get started. But just give it a minute and then we'll go. All right, so I think in the interest of time, we've got a lot to cover in the webinar today. So we'll get started and just let a few other people sort of join as they can. But welcome everyone to webinar 5 in our Accelerating Health Tech Innovation in West Yorkshire webinar series. We're halfway through the series now, and I hope those of you who've been joining the previous webinars have found them beneficial and useful. Just to give a very quick introduction to those of you who might be joining one of these webinars for the first time, my name's Lottie McMahon, and I'm a Health Tech Innovation Engagement and Delivery Manager for Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber, and I'll be moderating today's webinar that's part of our Accelerating Health Tech Innovation in West Yorkshire webinar series. This series is made up of 10 webinars, all designed to guide health tech innovators through the key stages of developing and adopting impactful health technologies. It's being run by Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber as part of Innovate UK's West Yorkshire Health Technologies Launchpad. And over this series, we're bringing together expert voices and regional leaders to provide practical insights, advice and guidance to help innovators like yourselves really accelerate your health tech innovations in West Yorkshire. This webinar is number 5 in the series, and we're going to be focusing on regulation for medical devices. As regulation is such a large and complex topic, and each of these webinars is only an hour, we've split medical devices and digital health into sort of 2 separate webinars. So this week's webinar is going to be focusing on medical devices, and then next week's will be more focused on digital health. Now, before I introduce our fantastic speaker that we've got joining us today, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping rules. So the webinar is going to be recorded. Originally, our plan was to share all of the recordings after the series had finished, but after getting some feedback, we're now going to share the recordings for all the previous webinars this week, so you can catch up on any sessions that you might have missed ahead of the upcoming ones. And then going forward, we'll be sharing each webinar recording during the week that it takes place. If you've got any questions throughout, please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions at any time. We have allocated some time at the end for questions, but I'd really encourage you to ask any that you have throughout, so we can either answer them at the time or allocate enough time at the end for questions. And during that Q&A at the end, you're welcome to ask your question directly if you'd like. Please feel free to just raise your hand and we can unmute you to then speak and ask it directly. That's all the sort of boring housekeeping bits out of the way, and I'd like to introduce our fantastic speaker that we've got joining us today. So we're joined by Richard Vincent, who is Principal Strategy Consultant for Regulatory at NAMSA, and he's going to be talking about the regulatory journey for medical devices, so touching on common pitfalls that you might find and support available for innovators. So thank you so much for joining us today, Richard. I'll stop sharing my screen and then sort of hand over to you to talk about regulation to the group.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share this. Share first. Can see that okay?
Yeah, that's come up.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good. I guess it is good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be just spending the next few minutes. This is going to be fairly broad in general. I know that there's a session, the next session is more focused on digital health, but I'm going to be talking just about the general pathways for getting products to market in the UK, and I'm going to talk about the comparison to the EU and CE marking and so forth. So, and then talk about, quality system, what would be needed, and talking about a little bit about clinical trials, and then maintenance of it. So again, pretty high level. You're getting a typical 3-day course in about 45 minutes. So it will be a fairly high level. Just to introduce myself a little bit further, I've been in the industry for quite some time, 30 years, and working mainly in medical devices. Worked in industry for about 18, 19 years, and then have been consulting for about 15 years. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, but I've been living here in the UK for over almost 15 years. So I've had most of my work has generally been in the European Union and the UK working on things. So with NAMSA and the consulting that I do, we usually do all phases. Then when you think about bringing a product to market, I generally probably half of my time I spend in what you say the concept and feasibility. So companies come to us and they have a product that they believe is a medical device. And so we go through and I help them determine, well, okay, what classification is it? So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. And then with any type of introduction to market, there's always much testing that has to be done. So depending upon what your needs are, we can certainly help with certain things. As an example, NAMSA was originally a biocompatibility testing facility, and that's primarily all they did, but now they do different types of microbiology testing and sterilization validation and so forth. So there are different companies that specialize in different things, which I'll talk about as we go through. So this first part of the session is talking about the classification and development activities. So going back to the basics, I think it's really important to understand that first you have to determine if your device is actually considered a medical device. Nowadays, in the 2025, and probably particularly in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of devices that I have looked at, and they say, yes, we want to CE mark this, or yes, we want to go to the United States, or we want to sell in Canada, Australia. And when they introduced the device to me, the first question I posed to them is, are you sure you're a medical device? Because depending upon what the device does, can really dictate whether it's regulated or not. So this is the simple definition of a medical device. And places like the European Union, when you see EMARC, they've even gone further, and they've added words and definitions such as prognosis and prevention of diseases and predication, because now you have software applications that can take 5 or 6 sets of data from a patient, maybe an IBD test, a blood test, blood pressure, weight, etc., and we'll actually do a prediction and say, well, yes, you are a candidate for having a stroke, or yes, you are a candidate for having cardiac arrest. So there's software applications now that take lots of data and put it into an algorithm. So in the European Union and the FDA, they realize these type of things happen. The UK hasn't updated their definition specifically yet, but generally they do recognize those prognosis and predication and the basic ones of diagnosing, monitoring, and preventing diseases. So nowadays in medical devices, you can be a software-only product. Nowadays, you can be combination products with different things like tissues, and you have nanotechnology. So but the 3 fundamental things of a device, medical device, is it needs to diagnose, it needs to monitor, and it needs to treat. And of course, this is different than a pharmaceutical product because it doesn't do it by it does it by a physical action. It doesn't do it by a metabolic or immunologic or a chemical type of process. But one of the challenges that companies have when they're going to market with their devices is, okay, so we are a medical device. We've determined we're a medical device. So what can we actually say about it? So In the regulations, they clearly define what is, well, I shouldn't say they clearly define, they help to define what is or what is not a medical device, but there is a lot of interpretation. You know, some regulatory agencies around the world are pretty conservative. I think the UK MHRA is pretty pragmatic, and they do have guidance documents, especially around software. And then you have claims on what you're telling that your products do. Now, you have to have evidence behind this and need to be truthful, but those claims are then what you put out into the public and what your labeling says. So in the regulated field, such as medical devices, especially in the UK, you do have to support whatever you say that your device does. And if it is a medical device, you need to have the sometimes even clinical evidence behind that. So in the UK, the current regulations are from 2002. They have made some amendments after leaving the European Union. However, the regulations are still based upon the Medical Device Directive, or the old regulations that was replaced in 2017. So after leaving, they didn't update their regulations to the new regulations for Europe. So it is still the older regulations. The challenge is that there are going to be some new regulations, but we actually don't know when that's going to happen yet. So we sort of have to wait and see. The good thing is that if you decide that you're going to go to the mainland, go to European Union, and you get CE marking, that actually is going to be recognized until June of 2030. So most companies today, when they're looking at the UKCA mark, they actually consider that they'll do both. They'll do the UKCA and the CE mark because it's more cost effective. And some companies actually only are getting the CE mark because they are going to be selling in Germany and Spain and Italy and so forth. And you sort of today you get the UK for free because the UK still does recognize the CE mark. Big question people ask is, well, what's going to happen after June 2030? Nobody knows. We don't know what's going to happen. So it will be important for companies that if they are planning to, you know, if they have a design development that is stretching out to that time frame, it's going to be really important to pay attention what's going to be happening with the UKCA mark. Similar to the European classification system, you have class 1, 2A, 2B, and 3, and you also have to have a quality management system. The difference is there's specific bodies within auditing bodies within the UK for the UKCA mark. And also another important point is that the auditing bodies in the UK cannot CE mark your product at the same when they're doing the UKCA. Now, luckily, there are notified bodies in the European Union and approving bodies in the UK that are the same. So you can sort of get a 2-for-1 in saying I need UKCA as well as CE mark, and you can use the same entity for doing that. But you have to tell them that you can't go and say I want CE mark and then just assume that you're going to get the UKCA at the same time, that because they are different requirements. In the UK, the conformity assessment is quite the same as the European Union. Again, you're going to use an approving body for the UKCA mark, and then using a notified body in the European Union. So because it's based upon the MDD, the fundamentals of how that's done is the same. So you need a quality management system that we'll talk about in just a little bit. This approving body will audit your quality management system as part of the approval process. And then you have to have what's called a technical documentation that has all the technical information about your product. So again, if you're looking to get into only the UK market, there is some cost benefit by just getting the UKCA mark. But you'd have to understand that because you have the UKCA mark, that's the only place you can sell it is UK. You would need the CE mark also for the European Union. And right now, there's a lot more scrutiny that's going on with that. So it is a little bit easier, I would say, to get the UKCA only, but that does limit your market. Any medical device manufacturer needs to register in the United Kingdom, whether you're a class 1 or class 3 device. All classes have to register. The UK has an electronic system for doing that, so they understand all the products that are being sold within the UK. And this does also include CE mark. So if you decide not to get the UKCA and just go with CE mark and sell it until June 2030, you still have to register your device in the DOORS system, which is the online registration system. And as I said before, there's a lot of uncertainty around the regulations and what they're going to look like. So the UK did create some amendments to the regulation to address some of the gaps that were existing. So as an example, you need what's called a UK responsible person. So if you sell into the European Union, sell into the UK, just like the European Union, if you're not located physically in that country, actually most countries, United States, Australia, they all have the same requirements. If you're located outside of the UK, to sell into the UK, you need a UK responsible person, and vice versa. Unfortunately, if your manufacturing site is here in the UK, you used to not need an authorized rep in the European Union, and now you do. So that's one of the changes. The UK MHRA are proposing some alternative pathways. There's been some consultation that's been sent out there. We don't know what's going to happen with that again. There's been talk about, well, if the company has the approval in the United States, or if they have approval in Canada, that's okay for the UK as well. So they're looking at, and CE mark as well. So after June 2030, we don't really know what's going to happen. So from a development standpoint, it's really important to understand what markets you're going to go into, because it will really depend on what that pathway for regulatory is going to look like. So when you're looking at bringing a product to market, there is a design development process. This is just a graphical view of what that looks like. It can be a very long process, depending upon the complexity of the device. But as you can see, there's little circles underneath each of those steps. And in fact, it looked too messy if I put all the circles there, but sometimes you may have to go back steps or go forward steps. So in the past, design controls, design development used to be was called a waterfall process. We just kind of went step by step, but we know it doesn't happen that way. You have to go back and forth into the inputs. Maybe you need to change things, but the important thing is that this needs to all be documented in a design and development file. So there is expectations that when you are bringing a product to market, that you are documenting your design activities. So the key question is, when does that start? And typically, when you get to that point where you've gone through concept and you say, yes, we have a device, we know what the regulatory pathway is going to be, and you start getting into the planning phase where you need to start defining the specifications, that's usually when you start documenting those activities. So you document as early as possible, because not only do you need it from a regulatory standpoint, but it can also protect your intellectual property at the same time. Because if you start documenting even concept ideas, you can make sure that those are clearly documented at the point when you need to get some patents or things of that nature. Plus, depending upon the complexity of your device, it's always good to start documenting things so that you can make sure that you're recording the information you have, so that you're not kind of spinning your wheels going back and forth, especially the further along that you get. So when we think of bringing a product to market, there's three sort of requirements that we think of. It's the requirements of the device. So often you'll have like a product requirements document. You'll have an environment, which is what the regulatory pathway is going to look like, what your manufacturing processes are going to look like. So this is part of your requirements related to the functionality and the environment. And then the third one is the requirements of the user. Some users just want it to be small and light or quick and fast. And that's okay, but you would define those user requirements. So all of these three requirements together help build what you would be doing as you go through the design development process. And starting early on the documentation is important because we have understanding, and we've actually been sort of analyzing this over the years, that if you wait till afterward to document things, the cost of that can be quite tremendously high as compared to if you just are documenting things as you go along. So there's a lot of things to do. This slide just gives you an idea of the type of things, the type of activities, the processes that you would encounter as you go through bringing a product to market. And again, depending upon which market this is pretty agnostic to the market because the design development process is the same whatever market, whether it's the UK or Europe. What you're going to find is in specific areas of the world, you're going to have very specific requirements. And unfortunately, the classifications of devices can be different between the regions. So as an example, if you bring a product to market, we've experienced this quite a lot, that we've gone to the United States and they have been okay with just non-clinical performance testing, bench performance testing. Whereas when we've brought the product to market for CE marking, they said you really need a clinical study to support the clinical evidence on this. And the problem with clinical studies is they can be very costly, but they can also take a tremendous amount of time as well. So if you're looking to get a market, within a year, and then you go to a region like, the UK or EU, and they say, well, you really need a clinical study, that could be another year that's added onto your timeline. So I can't stress enough how important it is to start documenting and understanding the regulatory pathway during the concept or feasibility stage, because then at least your eyes are open and you understand what would be required. In some regions, you can go to the regulatory agencies and get feedback on the preclinical testing and clinical testing. The MHRA, you can do that as well, especially if you need to do a clinical study, which is quite helpful. So there were some benefits of leaving the EU, because in the EU, as an example, you can't really go to somebody and say, hey, do we really need to do a clinical study? There's really no body or no entity out there that will give feedback on that. So it's really left up to the manufacturer. And then when they go through the approval process, sometimes they get those really surprises that happen. And then the other component, one of the components of getting to market is having a quality management system. So this helps, again, support documenting activities up front, understanding what design activities are required to be written. You don't need a full quality system right at the very beginning. That also can be an iterative process as you go through design. You can start on having some design components of your QMS. Then you can start working on the supplier components, because you may have a contract manufacturer making your product for you. Then you maybe have the manufacturing components, and then you can work on the post-market components once you submit the product, then you can work on those post-market activities. In almost all regions around the world, there's a little table there that shows you that they all require a quality management system. And this can be quite challenging for companies that are going through development, because they know they need to make a submission, but then they come to us and say, yeah, we're ready to CE mark. And we say, okay, how's your technical documentation? They say, yeah, we have this and this and this. And then we say, well, how's your quality management system look? And they say, well, do we really need that now? Which is challenging, because when you're ready to make submission, especially in the UK and the European Union, part of that approval process is having a quality management system. So it is important that this also is started as early as possible. In fact, many people say that it is something that needs to start before you start doing all your technical documentation gathering, because you need that structure in your company to show all the documentation and records. And then the second part here, I'm just going to talk about some pathways and some timelines and costs, and then just some general thoughts on market consideration, coming into the UK, and how that's compared to some of the other areas. So bringing a medical device to market can be costly. It depends upon the classification of the device, depends upon the complexity of the device. But one of the things that we see companies starting out is underestimating what these costs would look like. So again, it's really important that when you are starting to bring a product to market, being able to see the landscape before you, because there are going to be spikes as you go through. So as an example, when you need to test your product, a standard biocompatibility for a device that sits on the top of the skin is going to cost you 10, 12,000 pounds, just for a simple device. When you start getting into talking about implants that are kept in the body for a long time, that can get up to 100,000 pounds in just biocompatibility testing. If it's an electrical device, you have to have electrical safety testing, and that can run upwards of 30 to 50,000 pounds as well. So you're going to have these, and then when you go to submit your product to the approving body for a UKCA mark or CE mark, for the notified body, or maybe you do it at the same time. That's fine. It's great, because there is some cost savings doing it at the same time. However, to get a quality management system certification, it's going to cost you anywhere from 15 to 25,000 pounds for the first audit. But then you have to do that every year. So every year you need to be able to, you have another 5 to 8,000 pound bill that you're going to have to pay, because you have to maintain that certification. And then submitting the technical documentation for a UKCA mark will cost you, 20,000 pounds. So people have to, the companies they say, yeah, we know it's going to cost this much to develop the product, but they also don't consider kind of the costs that are going to go along the regulatory side. And if you don't have a regulatory person, then you got to come to somebody like me, who provides the consulting. And unfortunately, we don't do CE technical or UKCE technical files documentation for free. There's a cost with that as well. So the closer you get to the market, the costs go up, and it doesn't stop. That's the key point, because you're bringing a medical device to market. That those costs have to be maintained at some level. And again, depending upon the classification of the device, it can be quite expensive. So when we talk about, okay, that's great. We know there's some pre-submission costs. We know we need to have a quality system audit. We know we need to send our technical documentation. Then after that, we need to manage post-market surveillance. So UK MHRA has a well-established post-market system. And in fact, they released an amendment to the regulations last year that just became effective last week. So if you are selling any type of medical device in the UK, you have to follow and do these post-market reports. And as you can see, as you get it in higher in the classification, you have to do that more often. and there's a cost with this. And then if you have vigilance activities, such as if you have a serious incident, again, there's going to be there's a cost associated with that, because you have to report the incident, you have to follow up on it, you have to do investigations. So the point that I'm trying to get across is that when you're looking at bringing a device to the market, especially from an investment standpoint, you need to think about throughout the lifetime. Now, if your business model is to bring a product to the market for the first year and then sell because you've gotten to that point, that's great. Then maybe this slide you can completely forget about. But if you are going to bring a product to market and you do want to grow your business and you want to help people and make devices that help people, again, there's other activities that continue on beyond just getting either the CE mark or the UKCA mark. So these are just some general, very, very general estimates on timing. If you're a class 1 device, it's fairly minimal. There is an annual cost that's fairly minimal. But then as you get higher in the classification, so class 2A, 2B, 3, you can see the costs get quite expensive. And more importantly, when you're into the class 2A, 2B, you have those annual reviews that are done. You have to do annual post-market reports. So while clinical study might be a one-time event, and maybe the submission is a one-time event, if you make a significant change to your product, you might have to pay another £15,000 to have the technical documentation reviewed again, because if you make a significant change, the approving body in the UK would have to go and do another review. So those are, again, important things to think about, that there is an ongoing cost as we go along with that. The cost for CE marking is fairly it's fairly the same. It's probably a little bit more. So again, thinking about where you want to market your device, if you looking at both mainland as well as the UK, the costs can be sort of combined. So it's not double the cost, let's just say. You can sort of leverage the regulation in the European Union because it's the most scrutinizing right now. And then there'll be an extra little cost for UKCA mark. So here's just some examples or this is what you would look at for the European Union. Again, the costs are fairly about the same, given the conversion rate and so forth. But it is a bit more challenging to get the CE mark today, because there are, I wouldn't say more requirements. They're just the requirements are more stringent in the European Union, as well as there's more scrutiny. And the UK regulations are still under the MDD. Under the new regulation in the European Union, there's a few devices that have been up-classified. So interestingly, there's still some devices that you can sell in the UK that are class 1, but now currently today in the European Union, they would actually be considered a class 2A. So I know that people have been talking a lot about that and how that's going to get resolved, but it probably won't get resolved until we have a new regulation established. But when you're looking at bringing a product to market, you have these individual spikes of costs, but there is you do hit a plateau at some point, but there is a normal regular routine cost for doing quality and regulatory compliance. So when you are looking at getting to the market, you're saying, how do I get there? What do I do? What testing do I need? You also have to factor in your timelines, as well as your resources, as well as your costs. People that have that expertise and such as in the regulatory area have the knowledge. So if you say, yeah, we want to get CE mark and UKCA mark at the same time, but you don't have a regulatory expert, you're going to have to go find somebody. If you need to do a clinical study, you might have a principal investigator that is really good, and maybe they've done clinical studies in the past, so they can kind of do the work around that for you. But if you don't have those type of resources, you'll probably have to get a clinical expert or going to a like a NAMSA who does clinical research and have people that can develop protocols and analyze the data and write the reports and so forth. So consulting's, I mean, I'm a consultant, but you have to pick the right consultant. You have to make sure that you have somebody that that will be able to help you. Plus, you have to make sure it's almost like hiring somebody, because you have to make sure they have the right expertise in the right area as well. There's consultants that are just specialized in quality system. You go to them and say, well, I need help with the technical documentation, and they'll say, I can't help you with that. I just do quality systems. So you'll have to you might have to have a team of consultants. You'll need a clinical consultant, you need a QMS consultant, and you need a regulatory consultant. You might need a testing consultant. So when you're bringing a new product to the market, you want to look at how you can also leverage going to some of the larger consulting companies, like an NAMSA, where there's more individuals that you can just sort of pull on as you go through the process. And then certainly picking the right consultant can help hopefully get you to the market without too many hurdles that some companies do when they just try to do it on their own. So when we're looking at, what it is to bring a product to the market, some companies if I refer to the slide, some companies look at the first 3 gray boxes there. There's a gap in the market, or the current state of the art for the product is 20 years old, and they have some new technology that's going to help. They look at that and say, this is great, let's do it, and let's bring this product to market. And then they realize that they get down into the right side of the screen about clinical studies and regulatory submissions, and realize that it's a little bit more difficult getting this new technology on the market than they originally planned. So there is a view and how when new products can get on the market. And so when I'm helping companies look at their products, that's what we do. We go through a stepwise process. Sometimes we don't necessarily do market analysis, but we definitely recommend companies do market analysis. I've had too many horror stories in the last 10 years where we've had companies come to us and they've say, yeah, we want to get into the FDA, or we want to get into the European Union, and we start going through and we start the process, and then they come back when they've already sort of gotten 12 months into it, and they say, yeah, we have to stop because we actually don't have a market for our product. So it can be quite challenging. So there is a stepwise process that you can follow. Is there a market? Is there a healthcare need? So a lot of those questions get asked up front. And then you start saying, okay, we are a medical device, but then what is that regulatory landscape going to look like? So just some tips and some things to think about. Understand what the device does, understand how the device is going to be used. Those can all have an impact upon what your regulatory pathway is going to look like. Some devices only do diagnosis or monitoring or therapy. Some devices do all 3 at the same time. Some devices are very simple in their designs, less complex. I shouldn't say simple, but less complex. And some devices are very, very complex. So it's when you're going through those initial stages, it's better to ask all the questions up front, get all your planning things in place, understand what the regulatory requirements are going to be. Because I always tell companies this is not something that you're going to do necessarily in a few weeks. Some the companies come to us and say, "Yep, we have a finished design concept. We want to start CE marking this, or we want to get this into the UK." And then we have to break the bad news to them that it's going to be another 12 months through the submission process, where they were thinking that it was actually just going to be a few weeks, because we just put together the technical documentation and then we make a submission. How long is that going to take? So it is challenging when we do have these companies come to us and they realize that it is months long process, and especially if you're getting into CE marking or even UKCA, as you get into class 2B and class 3 products, you're not just talking months, but you're actually talking years between the clinical studies, the technical documentation reviews, setting up the quality system. So you really want to understand what it looks like from the very beginning. And then just as a comparison I wanted to just bring a comparison to the United States. Some people today are choosing the US over the UK and the European Union because it's just a much more established process. The review process is a bit less. As an example, you don't have to have quality management certification, quality management system certification to go to the US. Unlike in the EU and UK, you need to have your quality management system certified, or you have to have a quality management system in place, and the easiest is to get certified. So, but in the United States, you don't necessarily need to have that completely in place. It's completely left up to you. The submission process, some view is a bit easier. The FDA views clinical studies a bit more better than the European Union. So, but the challenge with going to the United States is it is helpful having somebody there that understands the process, because it is completely different regulatory pathway as compared to the UK and the EU. And then in other parts of the world, some companies say, well, if I start selling in places like Malaysia or Vietnam or Saudi Arabia or Morocco first, I can get some revenue going, and I can start getting some safety data and so forth. The challenging thing is that some places in the world aren't much better. As an example, there's about 45 or so countries that have a fairly robust regulatory system: Japan, China, Malaysia, Singapore, Mexico, Brazil. Those countries have a regulatory system, and some of them are actually even more challenging than the European Union or the UK system. So make sure again you know what market that you want to go for, because if you think that it's going to be easier, sometimes it's not. And many countries, that in order to sell your products in those countries, you need to have what's considered home country approval. So wherever you're based, you need to have that. So if I'm based in the UK, I need to have the UKCA mark. And I can use that as leverage for then registering and selling those products in the country. But many countries require that. They require that home country approval. Luckily, some of the systems are quite similar. So as an example, the classification system in Brazil and the European Union, in fact, Brazil just updated their regulations to align to the European Union. However, their regulatory submission process is different. You have to send it directly to the health authority there, and they go through the review. So again, it can, a lot of the regulatory requirements in different countries around the world are quite similar, but there are some differences and nuances. So if you are bringing a product and want to get into some of those countries, it is helpful to speak with somebody understanding what those regulatory requirements are, because going to places like China and Japan aren't necessarily going to be easier than going to the UK first, or the European Union. So in the United States, again, some more information on pre-market. They have what's called a 510K process. Again, some argue that this is a little bit easier than CE marking. It uses what's called a substantial equivalence, or a predicate device system. The thing about this one is that the review period is fairly well defined, unlike in the UK and the European Union. There's no timelines associated with that, so sometimes it can take months and months. But in the United States, these are fairly well defined. So again, some companies like to look at going to the United States first, because it's much more transparent. It's much more secure. It's much more known. Whereas in the European Union today, CE marking, getting a UK CE mark, sometimes that timeline is not really secure, especially for new and novel devices. And then in the rest of the world, the timelines can vary depending upon the country. You'll always need an in-country representation if you're not located there. Mostly due to the fact that when you submit, when you make the submission to those countries, it needs to be in the local language. So if you make an application in Japan that's called a shonen, it needs to be in Japanese. So when you have a complex device that the technical documentation is 400 pages, you have to start thinking about what that translation cost is going to look like. And then when you start having testing done, that also adds more complexity into it as well, because you're going to get testing reports that are in English, but then those testing reports need to be translated somehow. So when you're looking at those different countries, it is important to understand that, as well as just the confidentiality, because there's some concern that when you submit your technical information to other countries, that it's not necessarily kept confidential. Places like the United States, European Union, the UK, it is, but there is some challenges that people don't believe, and there is a perception that protection of technology isn't so secure in other places. And then if you do sell in other countries, it needs to be in the local language. Thank you very much. Again, that was just an overview. I tried to understanding where many of you maybe are at in the concept and feasibility stage, and try to give some ideas and thoughts about, getting into the UK market. But like I said, some companies, when they start talking to people about their regulatory pathway, realize that maybe that's not the best option right now, and look at some other options. So thank you very much, and I guess we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Richard. That was a fantastic presentation, and considering we only had an hour, it was really sort of detailed and comprehensive. Like you say, we do have 10 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, encourage you to pop them in the chat, or put your hand up virtually, and we can take you off mute. But maybe while we're waiting for any questions to come through, I can start with one. You did sort of slightly touch on it, Richard, earlier throughout the presentation, so touching on some of the potential mistakes the companies might make through this process, sort of maybe not thinking about certain elements early enough, or underestimating costs, and sort of not necessarily doing their market analysis early enough. I suppose my question might be a bit of a hard one to answer, but what would you say the sort of the number one sort of mistake or pitfall is that you see sort of companies making when they're still trying to get their health tech innovation through regulatory approval?
Yeah, probably the biggest one that we see is that companies are not documenting things. So you saw on the couple of slides, and I mentioned it, starting early. If you're in the development process, just start writing things down. Even if you think that, well, I'm still in concept. I don't have anything sort of formalized yet. why do I need to write things down? Why do I need to record things? And that's the biggest challenge that we see, that companies come to us, they're ready for submission, and they just don't have the proper documentation in place. And so that just adds cost to the overall process.
And are there any sort of resources out there with sort of frameworks or lists of what they should be recording at that sort of early stage, or any kind of resources out there to help guide so they know sort of what they should be recording?
That's the good part, is that does exist. So when I talked about the quality management system, it uses a standard called ISO 1345. There's a couple references to that. Some of you might have heard of that as well. There's a structure behind what is required for quality, not just design and development activities, but the overall quality management system. There's lots of guidance out there for design and development processes, what it should look like, what documentation you need to have in place. So there are a lot of resources. And then, of course, you can always find an external resource that can help, kind of guide you through that process as well.
I think we've had a couple of questions come through. I know Alex has his hand up, but I'll just refer to the chat first, because there was a question that came through that earlier. So when looking at regulatory approval in different countries, do the clinical trials need to be conducted in that specific country? For example, for the USA, does the FDA require that a clinical trial be conducted in the USA, or data from a clinical trial in the UK be acceptable?
Yeah. That's a fairly common question, so thank you for asking that. We get that question all the time. Most countries do require the clinical study to be performed in that country with that patient population, but it can depend upon the device. If you're talking a less complex device that can be generally used with a wide population, maybe that's not so important. But if you have a device that has a specific intended use, such as a surgical application, one of the things the regulators look at is, well, is the standard of care the same in the UK as it would be in the United States? More importantly, do they do the procedure, the surgical procedure, the same? So it's not only just about the patient population being similar, but it's also how the actual surgical application is being done. So most countries want to see the clinical study done in that country. However, there are exceptions. Sadly, you can't ask that in advance in the EU. But in the FDA, as an example, you can go to them and say, I've got some data from France. I've got some data from the US. Is that going to be okay? And they can give you the feedback, saying, yeah, that looks great, or no, you want to see more. So but generally it would be in the country.
Yeah, I think we've got a question from Alex, who has his hand up. So I'll just allow you to unmute, Alex, and you should be able to directly ask your question if the technology works. Fingers crossed. I think, Alex, you should be able to just click unmute.
Yeah. No.
If not, we can move on to one of the questions on the chat and come back. So there was a question from Anthony Smith in the chat around, for the EU, do you need to define which countries within the Union you intend to market in? Is the in-country representative needed for submission or once you launch on the market? And does PMS start post-approval to market or once you initiate sales?
Yeah, so the easiest one first is the representative. But there is some positive benefits with the EU, that it is the EU, so it gives you access to the market of all those 27 countries. So you only need one EU representative. So if you're a manufacturer based here in the UK and you do want to get CE mark and sell into the mainland, you just need one EU authorized representative wherever in any country that's in the EU. So that gives the flexibility that, yes, indeed, you can sell in any of the 27 countries. The only stipulation is that you would need to have the labeling in the local language. So if you're going to sell into France, it'd be in French, German, and so forth. So that's kind of really the only stipulation. But, that's why the CE mark is such an attractive pathway. because if you get just UK CE mark, you can only sell in the UK. So companies right now currently are getting UKCA and CE mark because it gives them access to 28 countries. The only difference is that you would need to have your labeling in the local language. And yes, post-market only starts when you actually get the approval. So you wouldn't need to do any post-marketing, but you would need to have the process set up so that when you launch, you were ready to start with that.
I think we've got one more question in the chat. So from Chris, asking if the design of a product changes, which then changes the intended use, does the regulatory process start from ground zero?
It doesn't start from ground zero, but when you have a change to the intended use of product, that's typically considered what in the regulatory world is called a significant change. And they would have to review your technical documentation again, both in the UK as well as EU. Actually, it's the same in almost any country, regulated country. If you make a significant change like the intended use, you would have to go through the approval process again. It's not necessarily starting from scratch because say the technology is not changing, but maybe it's just a new patient population for use. Or if maybe it's just a software change. Theoretically, it would just be looking at the differences of what that is. The challenge with change in intended population is sometimes it might require additional clinical studies. So that's what you'd really want to make sure that if you're changing intended use, that it's not going to require or needing to know if it's going to require additional clinical studies. But no, you shouldn't have to start from scratch again, but it would have to go through an approval process.
You've just got a follow-up question as well on that of does this apply to both non-therapeutic and therapeutic devices?
Yeah, I mean, when you say non-therapeutic, not quite sure follow that, but if you're a medical device, it would apply. These requirements would apply across the board. So if your device is just for diagnostic purposes or a diagnostic tool, if your device is just monitoring something or therapeutic, these would all apply. So again, that's why it's important at the very beginning you understand is my product a medical device or not? Because when you say non-therapeutic, if it's not giving the physician anything they need to make decisions on, maybe it might not be a medical device. But in our experience, generally it would still be considered a medical device. Plus, many companies want to be a medical device because, especially here in the UK, you can get on the NHS list of provided suppliers. So it's just they want to be in a revenue stream that's better than just going out and selling as product X.
Great. I think we're nearly at the end now. We've got just sort of 1 or 2 minutes. If there are any final last minute questions from anyone you want to pop in the chat. But if not, so probably start to wrap up the session. Just like to say a massive thank you, Richard, for joining and speaking to the group today. It's been a really, really great presentation. And thank you everyone for joining in the audience. If you've not signed up to any of the remaining webinars, we've still got 5 more to go, covering really good areas such as obviously digital health regulation, finance, sustainability and health technology and market access. So still some more sessions to join. Still is time to register. We have just had one final question. I don't know if Richard, if you've got time to answer one
Anthony,
more.
I did see that where combination products fit in. And let me just say, you can find me on LinkedIn if you want, because I think your answer is probably a 3-hour-long conversation. But combination products do fit in. Now, unfortunately, in the European Union, UK, the combination product space is very difficult because you're either a device or you're a drug, and there's nothing in between. So it is very complicated. In fact, a lot of the consulting help that I give companies is in the combination space because it is very complicated, but it does cover, the regulations do cover that, let's just say.
Maybe that's a great one for Anthony to maybe connect with you on LinkedIn and follow up for a bit of a longer sort of conversation around that. But yeah, well, thank you again, Richard. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you everyone for joining. We'll wrap up now, and we'll be sending out the recording for this later in the week. But thank you everyone, and hope you have a really good rest of the day.
Thank you.